For half a century, one story has followed Donald Trump like a shadow he could never outrun. He has called himself a very stable genius, mocked Harvard graduates as overrated, and told millions that education does not compare to instinct. But inside locked cabinets of a university office, a different record was waiting. In 1965, the SAT was the gateway to higher education. The national average hovered near 990, a line every ambitious student needed to clear. Trump's result was 970, not a mark of brilliance, but a narrow pass, barely equal to the average American teenager. It was enough to open a door, but not enough to prove what he would later claim. By 1970, at the Wharton School of Finance, another test was administered. An aptitude file, stamped and sealed, carried the numbers that told the truth behind the myth. Those pages measured verbal reasoning, logic, and quantitative skill. They did not match the boast that would dominate campaign rallies decades later. For years, Trump pointed fingers at professors and lawyers, laughing at Harvard and mocking Ivy League discipline. Yet the question now hangs heavier than ever. If the man who attacked education stood on weaker academic ground himself, what else in his public image was carefully constructed? Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett did not simply raise that question, she slid the file across the hearing table and let silence do the work. 12:47 a.m., Tuesday. The Capitol was asleep. Marble hallways stretched out in silence, the kind of silence so deep it carried its own weight. Security cameras blinked on and off like slow, mechanical heartbeats. The entire building seemed to breathe, as if resting after a day of political theater. And then it happened. A faint scrape across tile. Barely audible but unmistakable. A plain white envelope slipped under the door of Jasmine Crockett's office. No footsteps, no shadow, no sign of the hand that had delivered it. Just paper, gliding into the room like it carried its own gravity. Crockett was still at her desk, surrounded by towers of papers and half-finished notes. The lamp on her desk threw a cone of light across scattered transcripts, news clippings, and handwritten questions she'd been preparing for tomorrow's hearing. She leaned back, eyes heavy, when the sound pulled her attention down to the floor. An envelope. Ordinary at first glance. Weighty when she picked it up. Too weighty for what it looked like. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the thickness, the stiffness of something sealed long ago. The paper was aged, faintly yellow at the edges, the seal brittle like glass about to crack. She slid a letter opener through the seam. The tape gave way with a dry snap. Inside was a folder, the kind students used decades ago, manila, stiff, stamped across the front with the ink of a typewriter. The letters were uneven, some smudged, some faint. 4 words and a year. Wharton Aptitude Test, 1970. Her breath caught. She knew what she was holding before she even opened it. These were records people had whispered about, records rumored but never seen, files that don't appear by chance. Files that are locked away, sealed, guarded not for protection of history, but for protection of ego. Someone had chosen this moment. Someone wanted her to see this. The voiceover cuts in like a whisper sharpened into steel. If you want the receipts, stay. Crockett stared at the file. Her thumb brushed against the corner. She hadn't opened it yet, but she could feel the heat of it, the weight of what it meant. Because this was not just about grades, not just about numbers on a page. This was about a man who had mocked, belittled, and sneered at others for decades. A man who measured worth by shouting the word genius at himself. A man who demanded transparency from everyone else, but barricaded his own past. And now, in her hands, lay the truth. The folder felt like a time capsule cracked open in the dead of night. 55 years locked away. 55 years hidden behind lawyers, threats, and carefully cultivated myths. Yet here it was, not on a judge's desk, not in a private archive, but sliding under her office door at nearly 1 in the morning. Crockett placed the folder flat on her desk. For a moment she didn't move. She let the silence hang. She let the gravity of the hour press down on her. Then, slowly, she lifted the cover. Inside, neatly stacked, were sheets of test results, stamped with official seals from Wharton, marked with dates from 1970, typed in the cold mechanical language of academia. Scores. Rankings. Comments. The numbers were there, stark and unflinching. Not the numbers of a genius. Not the numbers of a man at the top of his class. The opposite. Scores that told a different story. A story that had been buried for half a century. Her eyes lingered on one line. Below expectations for Wharton admission. The room felt colder. She leaned back, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Outside her window, the Capitol dome gleamed faintly under the city's sleepless lights. Inside her office, time seemed to stretch. This wasn't just a file. It was a mirror. And that mirror was about to be held up. Live, in front of the nation. The question began forming in her mind. The question that would land not just like a challenge, but like a blade cutting through decades of self-crafted illusion. The question wasn't complicated. It was surgical. Just 2 words. Define genius. That question, anchored in the silence of this moment, would echo far beyond this room. It would travel into hearings, onto screens, into late-night conversations in kitchens and diners. It would split a myth wide open. Crockett flipped through the rest of the file, page after page confirming the same story. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't speculation. It was data, sealed, authenticated, time-stamped. She saw the metadata stamped at the bottom corner, 1970. Philadelphia. Filed, sealed, never released until now. The evidence had lived in the dark for over 5 decades, waiting for light. She set the folder down and pressed her palms flat against it. She understood immediately what this meant, not just for her questioning tomorrow, not just for the man who had built an empire on self-proclaimed brilliance. It meant for the first time, the record would speak louder than the myth. The voiceover enters again, calm but with the edge of inevitability. This is not just a score. It is a story 50 years in the making, a story that cannot be hidden forever. For a long moment she sat motionless. The only sound was the faint buzz of the fluorescent light above her, the sound of a city outside that never truly sleeps. Then she closed the folder, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into her bag. Tomorrow would not be like any other hearing. Tomorrow, when the cameras switched on and the room filled with murmurs, when the nation leaned closer to their screens, she would hold this truth in her hands. A plain white envelope, a brittle tape seal, a test score written in the cold ink of 1970. And she would ask the only question that mattered. Define genius. The camera lingers in silence for 6 long seconds. Long enough for the weight to sink in. Long enough for viewers to feel that something irreversible has just begun. This was how the story opened. Not with a headline, not with a speech, but with an envelope sliding under a door at 12:47 a.m., carrying with it the receipts that would turn arrogance into evidence and myth into record. And so the stage was set. The next morning, the world was awake before the Sunday screens lit up with headlines from the previous night, but none of them yet knew what was resting inside Crockett's bag. The file was still a secret, still silent, but not for long. Across the country, another scene unfolded. A rally stage, floodlights, chants echoing into the night air. And at the center, Donald Trump, with his familiar sneer, leaning into the microphone with the kind of smirk designed not for truth, but for applause. You know these people, these so-called smart ones, the lawyers, the Harvard types, overrated, low IQ, total disasters. The crowd laughed on cue. He let it ride, then jabbed again, louder, sharper. Especially that Crockett woman. Harvard Law. Big deal. I've seen brighter light bulbs. Total low IQ. Believe me. It wasn't new. For years the pattern was the same. Mockery first, facts never. Label someone low IQ and let the insult stick. Say it enough times and it becomes a headline. Repeat it louder and it becomes a brand. The insult wasn't meant to prove anything. It was meant to erase something. But this time, the words would boomerang back. Because this time, an envelope existed. The narration cuts in, calm and surgical. He mocked Harvard graduates while holding a file that told his own story. The first page of that file carried a number that stripped away the bravado. SAT score, 970 out of 1,600. The year was 1965. The national average hovered around 980 to 990. just enough to be considered passable. Trump's number sat one bubble below the line. One bubble away from failing. That phrase hung in the air like a verdict, not shouted, not mocked, simply read, quiet, measured, undeniable. The irony was almost mathematical. The man who built a career sneering at scholars, professors, and lawyers had scraped by with a score that wouldn't have placed him in the middle of the pack. Crockett studied the sheet late into the night. Each bubble on the test, each row of numbers, told a story different from the one shouted at rallies. This was no towering genius. This was a student barely clearing the floor, not reaching the ceiling. The parallel was too sharp to ignore. Trump standing on a stage calling others overrated, while the receipts showed a man admitted through a door others had to climb to reach. The test revealed not superiority but survival, not brilliance but privilege. And yet the rallies roared, because bravado is louder than a score sheet, until the score sheet is read aloud. The voiceover lowered to a whisper. He mocked the gatekeepers of knowledge, yet nearly failed to walk through the gate himself. The scene shifts again. Cameras roll back to the rally, Trump pacing the stage, finger pointed, voice raised. They think they're smart, but I'm smarter than all of them. Believe me. But the file told the opposite. The file said ordinary. The file said average, or worse. Crockett knew the weapon was not insult. It was contrast. Place his words beside his records, and the myth unraveled by itself. The cold line was already forming in her head, the one she would deliver when the cameras were on, the one that would silence a room, one bubble away from failing. 6 words, that was all it would take. Because nothing pierces mockery like measurement. Nothing disarms arrogance like receipts. As she read deeper, the story grew clearer. In 1965, Harvard's admitted students averaged well above 1,300. Yale, even higher. Princeton, the same. A score of 970 didn't just trail the elite, it barely met the floor of acceptance. Yet here he was, decades later, ridiculing those who cleared heights he never touched. Crockett pressed her hand flat against the folder. She wasn't smiling. This wasn't about comedy. This was about exposure. About holding the mirror steady and forcing the myth to look back at itself. The camera imagined in that moment, her at the hearing, file in hand, reading the number aloud, silence stretching for 6 seconds. And then the question, who exactly are you calling low IQ? The narration returned, steady, measured, unflinching. The record doesn't mock. The record doesn't exaggerate. The record doesn't perform. It simply sits, waiting to be read. Trump had his rallies. He had his microphones, his stages, his chants. But Crockett had something rarer. She had a number that had survived 5 decades of concealment. A number immune to spin, to applause, to denial. 970 out of 1,600. It wasn't just a score. It was a line carved into history, a line he could not escape. And soon, it would no longer belong to him. It would belong to the public. To the students who had been told they weren't smart enough. To the workers mocked as low IQ. To every person who had been laughed at by a man whose own numbers fell short of his arrogance. The contrast was the story. The rally jeers on one side, the sealed file on the other. One was noise. The other was record. The envelope had slid under her door at 12:47 a.m. By sunrise, she understood its meaning. And by tomorrow's hearing, the entire country would too. Because once the record is spoken, mockery can't survive. The folder had already delivered its first strike, the SAT score. But buried beneath that first page was something heavier, something more damning than a number from high school. Crockett turned to the second section of the file, a set of stamped documents, sealed under brittle tape for 55 years. The heading, typed in rigid black ink, Wharton School of Finance and Commerce, Aptitude Examination, 1,970. The paper smelled of age, faintly metallic, as though time itself had pressed into it. She ran her finger down the page. A line jumped out. Overall performance, below expectations. Not outstanding, not promising, not even average. The words chosen by professors half a century ago cut colder than any modern insult. Below expectations. She glanced at the metadata. Lower corner, typed in small print, Official timestamp 1970, Philadelphia. Stamped, archived, sealed. Never touched again until tonight. The voiceover came in low, deliberate. Sealed for 5 decades. Released in silence. Tonight, it speaks. Crockett leaned back, eyes fixed on the words. It wasn't shock, it was confirmation. For years the whispers had circled. Maybe his entrance was special. Maybe the grades weren't real. Here was the paper trail, the echo of professors who had seen the truth long before the public did. She turned the page again. More scores, columns of numbers, each lower than the next. Logical reasoning, below average. Quantitative analysis, below average. Written communication, below average. The test had not been cruel. It had simply been accurate. And yet for 50 years the story told was different. A story of genius, of brilliance, of being at the top of the class. That story had echoed across interviews, speeches, books. But now, the receipts stood in quiet rebellion. The narration drew out the silence. 6 seconds. Long enough for the myth to collapse. Long enough for the truth to breathe. Crockett closed her eyes for a moment and imagined tomorrow. The hearing room. Cameras blinking red. Trump sitting across the table, his familiar lean-back pose, his arms folded like armor. She imagined the moment she would slide the folder across the desk, open it slowly, and read the words aloud. Overall performance, below expectations. The silence would stretch. 6 seconds, an eternity in broadcast time, and then her voice, calm and surgical, define genius. That would be the cut. Not a yell, not a clash, a scalpel, not a hammer. 2 words designed not to accuse, but to expose. She opened the file again, eyes scanning the handwritten comments. A professor had scribbled notes in the margin. Struggles with focus. Requires additional support. Not recommended for advanced placement. The ink was faded, but the meaning was fresh. This wasn't brilliance. This wasn't even competence. It was the story of a student who would not have made it through the gate without someone else holding it open. The voiceover pressed the question outward, past the page, past the man. How many doors were opened for him that closed for others? How many students were told no while privilege rewrote his answer sheet? The pages were not angry. They did not gloat. They simply existed, silent for decades, waiting for this moment. Crockett thought of the mockery, the low IQ taunts, the sneers at Harvard, the laughter at lawyers and judges. The irony felt almost unbearable. A man who barely cleared the floor, mocking those who scaled the ceiling. And here, at last, the receipts. She closed the folder again, the brittle tape crunching faintly under her fingers. She whispered the words to herself, rehearsing for the moment. Overall performance, below expectations. Then, the pause. 6 seconds. Then, define genius. The narration rose like a verdict. The test never lied. The records never mocked. They only waited. Crockett slid the envelope back into her bag. She looked around her office, the stacks of files suddenly less heavy than the one she had just read. She knew this was bigger than a hearing. Bigger than one exchange on live TV. It was about myth versus measurement, arrogance versus record. And in the battle between those, the record always wins. Outside, the Capitol dome gleamed under the sleepless Washington sky. Inside, a plain white envelope had just changed the course of tomorrow. 12:47 a.m. had delivered a secret. By tomorrow afternoon, that secret would no longer belong to her. It would belong to the nation. 970 out of 1,000. 600. Below expectations. A myth confronted by paper. And one question hanging in the air, sharpened like a blade. Define genius. For decades after that test, the record slept in silence. The folder was hidden, the comments forgotten, the numbers sealed away. But outside those walls, the myth only grew. The 1,980 seconds arrived, a decade of neon lights, television excess, and booming headlines. And Donald Trump stepped onto the stage as if it had been built for him alone. He posed with skyscrapers, plastered his name in gold, and turned press conferences into his own personal theater. But more than buildings, more than casinos, more than magazine covers, he built one thing above all else: the myth of his mind. Clips from that era show him speaking with unshakable confidence. Reporters asked about his success, and he leaned back with that familiar smirk. I was always at the top of my class, always one of the smartest. People don't know, but Wharton very tough school, the hardest, and I was one of their best. Ask anyone. The voice carried not evidence, but certainty. And certainty, when repeated often enough, starts to sound like proof. Newspaper archives from that period tell a different story. Pages filled with glowing features about Trump the dealmaker, Trump the builder, Trump the showman. But nowhere, not once, did a reporter find or print actual grades, GPAs, transcripts. The record never surfaced, because it could not. The myth did the work. The myth was enough. Receipt number 3 lives in those archives. An internal memo from Wharton, unearthed years later, typed in the same mechanical font as the test itself. Student admitted under special considerations. Not excellence, not merit. Considerations. The word sits heavy on the page. It is the polite language of institutions protecting privilege. Doors don't swing open on their own. They are pushed. And in this case, they were pushed by family donations, by name, by weight, not of intellect but of influence. The narration slows, deliberate. Privilege often writes the introduction. Records write the truth. Through the 1,980 seconds, Trump strutted across magazine covers, declaring himself the genius of real estate, the wizard of finance. He bragged about being at the top of his Wharton class, though not a single professor ever confirmed it. He boasted of brilliance, though not a single transcript ever proved it. He used words like weapons, smartest, best, top. Words repeated on loop until the public stopped asking for proof. But the file sat in silence, holding the opposite story. Scores below expectations, notes of struggle, a professor's warning that advanced placement was not recommended. A record of mediocrity hidden under a coat of gold. The irony deepened in every clip. A man standing before cameras, announcing genius, while his own professors had marked the opposite. A man declaring himself at the top, while the numbers showed the floor. The myth grew unchecked because silence is powerful. When the truth is hidden, a lie can dance in its place. For decades, no one held the mirror up. No one pressed the receipts against the myth. And so the myth became reality in the public mind. Crockett understood this better than most. She had watched the clips, read the articles, studied the archive. She knew the bragging years were not just about business or buildings. They were about constructing an untouchable image. An image where intelligence was not questioned, because to question it was to risk being mocked as low IQ. The voiceover sharpened. Confidence without record is performance. Arrogance without evidence is theater. And theater can last decades, until the receipts arrive. By the end of the 1,980 seconds, Trump was everywhere: television, tabloids, interviews. He declared himself not only successful, but brilliant beyond comparison. He didn't just claim to be smart, he claimed to be the smartest. The myth was no longer a boast, it was a crown. And yet, behind that crown, in the archives of Wharton, the memo Saturday admitted under special considerations. A quiet footnote that revealed the truth beneath the gold veneer. Crockett looked at that memo in her hands. The ink faded, but the meaning fresh. She imagined reading it aloud at the hearing, sliding it across the desk, asking calmly, "What kind of genius needs special consideration?" Silence would follow, not because the question was complex, but because the answer was obvious. The bragging years were loud, but the records were louder. Trump had built towers of glass and steel, but records are stronger than concrete. They do not age. They do not bend. They do not collapse. They sit quietly, waiting for their moment. And that moment had arrived in the form of a plain white envelope sliding under a door at 12:47 a.m. The narration tightened like a noose. The myth of genius was built in daylight. The truth of mediocrity was sealed in darkness. Now, both stand in the same room. For decades, he had called himself the smartest. For decades, he had laughed at the low IQs of others. For decades, the world had listened because there was no counterweight. Now, Crockett held the counterweight in her hands. A folder, a memo, a score, receipts that whispered louder than any chant at any rally. The bragging years were over. Tomorrow the mirror would be lifted. Tomorrow the myth would meet the record. And when that moment came, only one truth would remain. Privilege might open the door, but records never lie. By the 2000s, the myth had matured into something bigger than real estate, bigger than casinos, bigger even than television. It had become a claim of superiority that reached beyond business. Trump no longer just called himself successful, he called himself a genius. In interview after interview, he leaned back in his chair, arms folded, smile sharpened like a blade. People don't know this, but my IQ is one of the highest, maybe 180, higher than any president, higher than any of these so-called experts. Believe me, the words weren't whispered, they were shouted. He repeated them with the confidence of a man who assumed no one would ever check, and for years no one did. Because when someone insists loudly enough, often enough, doubt fades. But the file was still there, waiting. Crockett sat at her desk, playing back one of those clips from the early 2000s. Trump's voice filled the room. "I guarantee you, my IQ is higher than anyone you've ever met." The crowd laughed, the interviewer smiled, and the myth grew another inch taller. She reached into the envelope and pulled out the receipts. Not speculation, not rumor numbers. Numbers that didn't need to shout. Numbers that didn't need applause. IQ 180. That was his boast. But the aptitude test in her hands showed the opposite story. Scores marked below expectations. Professors scribbling notes about struggle. A sealed record that laughed not with arrogance, but with evidence. The voiceover cut in cold. "A claim without proof is noise. A record without spin is truth." Crockett let the clip play longer. Trump shifted topics, pivoting from his own alleged brilliance to a demand aimed outward. Why won't Obama release his transcripts? Why won't he show his grades? What is he hiding? Receipt number 4 sat in her hands. Trump, on camera, demanding others release records while guarding his own with lawyers and threats. The hypocrisy was surgical in its simplicity. A man who built his brand on questioning others' intelligence, while burying the receipts of his own. Crockett pictured the hearing. Trump seated at the witness table, cameras rolling. She would let the clip play, his voice booming. Obama should release his transcripts. Then she would hold up the file, open it slowly, and let the silence do the work. 6 seconds. That was all. Long enough for the hypocrisy to hang heavy in the air. Long enough for viewers across the country to feel the weight of the contradiction. Then she would cut in, calm, surgical, precise. Stand by your own standard. The room would freeze, because those 5 words pierced deeper than any insult. They did not accuse. They did not mock. They demanded consistency. If you call others to reveal, reveal yours. If you demand proof, accept proof. If you measure worth by grades, live by your own numbers. The voiceover whispered the verdict. The test of integrity is not what you demand of others. It is what you demand of yourself. Crockett turned the page again. More test results, more notes, each one confirming what the file had already screamed in silence. Below expectations, below average. A student carried not by intellect, but by doors opened through privilege. She closed the folder and let her hand rest on top of it. The weight wasn't just paper, it was history pressing down. For decades, Trump had spoken the word IQ like it was a weapon. He pointed it at critics, at journalists, at rivals. Low IQ, he said, as if intelligence could be erased by an insult. As if arrogance could substitute for evidence. But IQ is not declared, it is measured, and the measurement had been written long before the insult. Crockett knew that when the cameras rolled, the moment had to be measured too. Not with shouting, not with spectacle, with silence, with precision, with receipts. She imagined it clearly. She would read his words aloud. My IQ is 180. Then she would lay down the paper. The one stamped by Wharton. Overall performance. Below expectations. And then the pause. 6 seconds of silence. 6 seconds where arrogance collapsed into emptiness. And then, her voice cutting the still air. Stand by your own standard. That was the strike. Not anger, not insult. Truth, delivered quietly enough to echo louder than any rally chant. The voiceover pressed the moral outward, to every ear listening. Arrogance inflates. Records deflate. Claims rise like smoke. Receipts remain like stone. By the end of the night, Crockett knew part 5 of this story was not about numbers alone. It was about the demand for consistency, the demand for honesty, the demand for living by the rules you impose on others. Because when arrogance hides in the dark, silence gives it room to grow. But when the light hits, the myth shrinks. 970 out of 1,600. Below expectations. And the loudest voice in the room brought to silence by his own standard. The folder told its story in silence. But sometimes silence is not enough. Sometimes you need a witness. In 2019, that witness sat before Congress, right hand raised, voice steady, face pale under the lights. Michael Cohen, once Trump's fixer, now his accuser. He had been the man behind the curtain, the one who sent the threats, the one who enforced the silence. And now, the curtain was torn open. The camera zoomed in, the microphones picked up every word. Cohen leaned into the mic and delivered a line that cut through the room like a blade. "Mr. Trump directed me to threaten his schools, his colleges, and the College Board to never release his grades or SAT scores." The hearing room froze. Members of Congress shifted in their seats. Some scribbled notes. Others simply stared. Receipt number 5 lived in that moment. A sworn statement, on record, broadcast live across the country. Trump had not just hidden his records. He had threatened institutions to keep them buried. The narration lowered, deliberate. What he feared then? Reached her desk now. Crockett replayed that clip in her office. Cohen's voice echoed against the walls. The words felt heavier now, because the envelope had confirmed them. It wasn't just testimony, it was corroboration. Cohen had described the wall of secrecy, and the file sliding under her door had torn a brick from it. She pictured the parallel. Tomorrow, in the hearing room, she could let Cohen's voice play on the big screen. His testimony rolling out, the words, "never release his grades," ringing in the chamber. And then she would lift the folder. The very records he had tried to bury, the very numbers he had ordered into silence. The irony was complete. The man who had mocked others as low IQ had feared his own numbers so deeply he unleashed lawyers and threats to silence them. But silence does not erase truth. It only delays it. The voiceover whispered the verdict. Threats may delay a record. They cannot erase it. Truth waits. Receipts do not forget. Crockett let the silence hang in her office. 6 seconds, just enough time for the words to sink in. She turned back to the folder. The professor's comments, the aptitude results, the SAT score, all of it now stood as evidence not only against arrogance, but against hypocrisy. And Cohen's testimony sealed the link. This was no longer just about numbers. It was about fear. Fear of exposure so deep that threats were necessary to keep the myth alive. She imagined asking the question, live on air, her voice calm and surgical. If your IQ is as high as you say, why did your lawyer threaten every school you ever attended? No need for insult. No need for volume. Just the question. Silence would do the rest. Because fear of exposure speaks louder than any claim of genius. Cohen's testimony had revealed something deeper. Arrogance is fragile. A man who truly believes in his brilliance does not hide the evidence. He flaunts it. He publishes it. He frames it on the wall. But a man who fears the truth buries it, threatens it, smothers it. The voiceover sharpened. What arrogance declares, fear denies. What myth builds, threats protect. And when the threats fail, the receipts speak. The hearing room in 2019 had been electric. Cohen's words had drawn gasps, murmurs, headlines. But in 2019, there were no receipts in hand. There was testimony, but not the paper. There was accusation, but not the file. Now, in 2025, Crockett held both. The testimony and the paper. The accusation and the receipts. The silence of records broken open by the voice of a witness. The balance had shifted. Tomorrow's hearing would not echo 2019. It would go further. Because this time, the receipts would be read aloud. She closed the folder again, pressing her palm against the brittle cover. In the silence of her office, she could almost hear Cohen's voice one more time. Never release his grades. The irony was almost poetic. The very words meant to lock the file away now unlocked it. The very threats meant to bury it had become the evidence against it. Crockett exhaled slowly. Tomorrow was not just another hearing. Tomorrow was a reckoning. 970 out of 1,600. Below expectations. A lawyer's threats. A witness's testimony. And a folder that had survived both silence and intimidation to land in her hands. The narration closed in, cold, inevitable. What he feared most was never the number. It was the moment the number would speak louder than his voice. And that moment was coming. The insults were never random. They were a pattern. A script rehearsed and performed so many times that it became a reflex. Low IQ. Stupid. Dumb as a rock. He had used those words on senators, journalists, actors, students. He aimed them at critics, rivals, even allies who crossed him. He mocked Harvard. He mocked lawyers. He mocked professors. The insults were not measured. They were carpet-bombed, designed to stick in headlines and crawl across screens. The montage plays in the mind. Trump at rallies, pointing to the press pen. Low IQ reporters. Trump on television, smirking into the camera. That senator? Dumb as a rock. Trump online at 2 in the morning, typing in capital letters, branding opponents as stupid for the world to repeat. The words echoed louder than any record because for decades the record stayed hidden. But now, Crockett held the counterweight. Receipt number 6 sat in her folder, a timeline chart, meticulously drawn. On one side, the SAT scores of students admitted to Harvard in 1965. On the other, Trump's score of 970. Harvard's average hovered around 1,300. His number barely cleared the floor. The contrast was surgical. A man who mocked Harvard students as overrated had scores that would never have cleared Harvard's gate. A man who sneered at lawyers for being not that smart could never have made it into their ranks. The narration cut in. Cold. Mockery is cheap. Records are permanent. Crockett studied the chart. She imagined projecting it onto the screen at the hearing. A clean split down the middle. On the left, the average score of Harvard admits. On the right, his 970. Numbers that told a story in silence. Numbers that mocked the mockery itself. 6 seconds of quiet would follow. The room would hold its breath. And then, her voice, sharp as a scalpel. When you laugh at others for their intelligence, remember this line. She would trace her finger down the chart. Let the numbers speak louder than any insult. Patterns matter. Insults are noise until you map them. When mapped, they reveal something deeper. A man who called others low IQ was projecting his own fear. A man who mocked lawyers feared transcripts. A man who sneered at students feared comparison. The voiceover whispered the conclusion. Those who mock knowledge often fear the test. The insults had worked for years because they were loud, and loudness fills silence. But once silence is broken, loudness collapses. Crockett knew this. The hearing would not be about volume. It would be about receipts. She flipped through her notes, each one marked with the insults he had delivered across decades. Senator, journalist, rival, even his own allies when they turned against him. The insults all had the same shape, the same sting. Stupid, dumb, low IQ. The repetition was the point. Repeat it enough, and it becomes a brand. But brands dissolve when receipts arrive. The timeline in her hands was more than numbers. It was context. It was contrast. Harvard's admitted class soaring above 1,300. Trump's 970 dragging below. His insults turned back against him not with words, but with measurement. Crockett pictured the silence again. 6 seconds. The audience holding its breath, waiting for his rebuttal. But rebuttals cannot erase records. The voiceover pressed the moral. Insults echo. Records endure. For half a century he had sneered at intellect. He had ridiculed achievement. He had laughed at those who climbed higher than he ever could. But now, Crockett held the chart that revealed the truth. The mockery was projection. The arrogance was camouflage. And tomorrow, in front of the cameras, she would lift the camouflage. 970 out of 1,600. Harvard admits 1,300. His words, overrated. His record, below expectations. The irony did not need to be shouted. It only needed to be read. The narration closed the loop. The man who mocked knowledge was undone by the test he could not erase. The pattern of insults was the shadow. The record was the light. Crockett closed the folder once more. She let her hand rest on the brittle cover. Tomorrow, the insults would meet their mirror. Tomorrow, the pattern would be exposed. And once exposed, no amount of shouting could cover the silence of a record. The file did not stay in the hearing room. Records never do. Once spoken aloud, once lifted from paper into voice, they spread. They ripple outward, and the ripples turn into waves. It started the way every story starts now, with a clip, 16 seconds long. Crockett holding up the chart, her finger tapping the number. Her voice calm, steady, 970 out of 1,600. The pause that followed lasted 6 seconds, but online, it lasted forever. Within an hour, the clip was everywhere. Phones lit up, laptops pinged, living rooms filled with the soundbite. Seniors in Ohio replayed it twice, whispering to each other, "He called us low IQ for years. Look at this." Students in dorm rooms leaned over glowing screens, laughing at the irony. Late-night comedians sharpened their monologues before the ink was even dry. On Twitter, hashtags began climbing. Number 970 files. Number define genius. On TikTok, high schoolers overlaid their own SAT scores above the number 970, mocking the man who once bragged about being smarter than anyone. On Facebook, parents shared the clip with captions like, "My kid worked harder for college than this man ever did." The voiceover cut in with a verdict. A number turned into a mirror, and a mirror turned into a movement. But it wasn't just humor, it was recognition. People who had been called stupid, who had been dismissed as uneducated, suddenly saw themselves in the receipts. Workers who had been laughed at as low IQ by powerful voices now looked at that number and realized the insult had always been projection. Talk radio in Michigan buzzed with callers. "I never went to college, but I always felt looked down on. Now look at this." He was the one barely making it through. A retired teacher in Florida posted a trembling video. "I taught students who scored higher than 970 and never got into Harvard. But he mocked them. He mocked us. These records matter." The echo chamber was no longer his stage. It belonged to the receipts. Crockett scrolled through her phone that night. Seniors posting screenshots of their own scores from decades ago. Students sharing memes that read, "Define genius, 970. Late-night shows looping the clip with laugh tracks. But beneath the humor, there was something heavier, something moral. The voiceover sharpened. When arrogance collapses, people find themselves in the rubble. They see their own worth, reflected in the lie that fell. In living rooms across the country, families talked about privilege, about doors that open for some and close for others, about students who work 2 jobs to scrape into college while others glide through with a family donation. The number had become more than a score. It had become a symbol. The hashtags grew louder. Number 970 files. Number define genius. But another began rising, almost organically. Number IQV's integrity. Because the contrast was clear. Intelligence is not arrogance. Intelligence is honesty, discipline, respect for knowledge, and integrity will always outlast insult. Crockett watched it unfold. She hadn't planned the echo, but she knew it was inevitable. The receipts were never hers alone. Once read aloud, they belonged to everyone. The voiceover whispered the truth. Records are not personal, they are public. Once revealed, they belong to the people. Late-night shows turned it into comedy. TikTok turned it into satire. Seniors turned it into testimony. But the effect was the same. The myth cracked, the echo grew. And once the echo begins, no stage, no rally, no chant can drown it out. 970 out of 1,600. Below expectations, 6 seconds of silence, and a nation that saw itself reflected in the truth. The mockery had always been loud, but now the receipts were louder, and the echo was just beginning. By now, the number was no longer just a number. It had become a question, not just what he scored, but how he entered. Because numbers matter, but doors matter more. Crockett returned to the file, flipping past the test results, past the comments in fading ink, until she reached a thinner folder inside. A single page stood out, attached with a rusted staple. The heading, Donations, 1,968. She read the line twice to be sure. A family contribution to Wharton, made just 2 years before the aptitude test. The amount was large enough to matter, small enough to disguise. But the meaning was unmistakable. Privilege had paved the way. Receipt number 7. Crockett let the paper rest on her desk. She pictured the hearing. She would hold it up slowly. Not with anger, not with theater, but with precision. Her voice steady, almost quiet. If merit was the gate, who opened it for you? That question was not about scores. It was about systems, about how some climb ladders rung by rung, while others step into rooms where ladders don't exist. The voiceover lowered, deliberate. Doors don't open by themselves, they are pushed, they are paid for, and the silence around them is louder than the knock. She imagined the room in that moment, the question hanging heavy. 6 seconds of stillness. Trump leaning back, arms crossed, no words ready. Because how do you answer a question when the answer is written on the page in front of you? If merit was the gate, it had closed. If privilege was the key, it had turned. The receipts didn't accuse, they revealed. Crockett flipped the page again. The donation record was signed in neat handwriting, dated in the fall of 1968. Just enough time to smooth a path, just enough weight to shift a decision. Wharton had admitted him under special considerations, and now the reason was in ink. The irony pressed down harder. For decades, Trump had called others unworthy. For decades, he mocked immigrants, minorities, workers as low IQ. And yet, the only reason his own path continued was not merit, but money. The narration sharpened. When privilege is the door, merit is the excuse, and excuses are fragile when receipts arrive. Across the country, the echo deepened. Students who had been rejected from colleges despite perfect scores began posting online. 970 with a donation gets you in. 1,500 without doesn't. Parents who had saved for years to send their children to school shook their heads at the reality. Seniors who had believed the myth of genius realized the truth was bought, not earned. Crockett knew this part would land hardest. Not because it was scandal, because it was systemic. It was bigger than one man. It was about the weight of privilege, bending the rules, erasing the competition, rewriting the narrative. And so the question had to be asked, slowly, surgically. If merit was the gate, who opened it for you? The silence that followed would be its own verdict. The voiceover whispered the conclusion. Records reveal numbers, but privilege reveals systems. And systems, once exposed, demand answers. Crockett closed the folder, tucking the donation record back into its place. She looked at the envelope, plain and white, now heavier than ever. This wasn't just about IQ. It was about integrity. It was about how far arrogance can stretch when privilege carries it on its shoulders. 970 out of 1,600. Below expectations. A donation in 1968. A door opened not by merit but by money. Tomorrow, the hearing would not be about insult versus insult. It would be about record versus privilege. And privilege has no answer when receipts are read aloud. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It never does. It began with a chyron. On CNN, the banner at the bottom of the screen read in bold, unflinching letters, 970 out of 1,600. No commentary, no adjectives, just numbers. Numbers stronger than any insult. Within minutes, other outlets followed. MSNBC ran the clip of Crockett's 6-second pause on repeat. The New York Times published an op-ed titled The 970 That Changed the Room. Even Fox News, cautious in tone, could not avoid the headline. The number was everywhere. And then came the memes. Twitter filled with side-by-side images. Trump at rallies shouting, low IQ. On one side, the test score 970 on the other. TikTok spun it into music tracks, the number flashing in rhythm with the beat. Late-night comedians turned it into punchlines. He says he's a genius. The receipts say he's a C- myth. But beneath the jokes was something deeper. The image itself had cracked. Crockett sat in the hearing, the folder open before her, the cameras locked onto her every move. She didn't need to raise her voice. The receipts were doing the work. She leaned forward, her tone steady, surgical. When you measure others by standards you yourself never met, that's not confidence, it's fraud. The words landed like a hammer in a room that had already gone still. GOP members shifted uneasily. Papers rustled without purpose. The silence felt heavier than any applause. The voiceover pressed the knife further. Fraud is not always about numbers on a balance sheet. Sometimes, fraud is the myth you sell to the world about yourself. The camera caught Trump's face. Arms crossed, lips pursed, leaning back in the chair. But no words came. For the first time, the voice that had filled rallies and dominated headlines found itself cornered by silence. 970 out of 1,600. Below expectations. A donation in 1968. Special considerations. Fraud disguised as genius. Crockett closed the folder slowly, her palms resting on top as though sealing it again. She looked across the table, her eyes steady, and delivered the final cut. Privilege may have opened the door, but records will close it. 6 more seconds of silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty but full of recognition, full of collapse. The media outside wasted no time. Clips circulated with captions like, "When receipts speak, myths die." Hashtags surged again. Number 970 files. Number define genius. Number truth over mockery. Students mocked the score with parody tests online. Seniors called into radio shows, recounting their own struggles for college admission. Across the country, people spoke a phrase that hadn't existed the day before. 970. It became shorthand, a code, a single number carrying the weight of an entire myth undone. The voiceover sharpened into a verdict. Reputation collapses not when enemies strike, but when records reveal. For decades, he had walked on stages with the confidence of untouchable myth. But myths collapse quickly when receipts arrive. The image of genius, of superiority, of intellect beyond comparison, it dissolved in the silence of the room. 970 out of 1,600. Fraud, not confidence. Privilege, not merit. Image, not reality. And for the first time in half a century, the record spoke louder than the myth. The number did not fade when the cameras turned off. It grew. In diners across Pennsylvania, strangers pointed at televisions hanging above the counter. 970, one man muttered, shaking his head. In classrooms from Boston to California, students whispered it to each other like a riddle that solved itself. In retirement homes, seniors sat up straighter, nodding. They had lived long enough to know what privilege looks like, and now they had the proof. 970 out of 1,600. Below expectations. Fraud, not confidence. The aftermath was not noise. It was clarity. For decades, the myth had clouded the air. For decades, the insults had filled the room. But when the number appeared, the fog cleared. On social media, hashtags held for 48 hours straight. Number IQV's integrity. Number truth over mockery. The conversation shifted. People weren't just mocking the score, they were debating integrity itself. What does it mean to measure others when you never meet the measure yourself? What does it say about a nation when privilege replaces merit? The voiceover pressed in, calm but unrelenting. Real intelligence is not arrogance. Real strength is not insult. Real worth is not privilege. It is honesty, discipline, and respect for knowledge. Records never lie. News anchors repeated the phrase. Editors wrote it into headlines. Commentators on radio stations quoted it, word for word. Records never lie. Crockett did not linger in the spotlight. She didn't need to. The work was already done. The file was public. The receipts had entered the bloodstream of the nation. The myth was cracked, and cracks never disappear. They spread. In living rooms, families talked about their own experiences. Parents reminded children that effort matters more than ego. Teachers told students that intelligence is not a number on a page, but the discipline to face the truth. Seniors reminded their peers that integrity outlasts arrogance. The phrase 970 became shorthand not for failure, but for hypocrisy. A reminder that arrogance without evidence collapses. That privilege without integrity cannot last. And then came the moral question. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about everyone watching. The narration slowed, almost whispering. What do we value? More arrogance or honesty? Mockery or respect? IQ or integrity? That was the real test. Not an aptitude test sealed in 1970, but a moral test faced in 2025. Crockett had asked the question in the hearing, define genius. The nation now asked itself a different one, define integrity. 970 out of 1,600. A myth undone by its own receipts. The final voiceover pressed the message, steady and unshakable. Arrogance fades, privilege collapses, records endure, and integrity is the only test no one can cheat. The story ended not with applause, not with chance, but with clarity. A plain white envelope slid under a door at 12:47 a.m. had cracked a myth half a century old. And in the silence that followed, the truth was louder than any insult ever spoken. If you want the receipts, stay. Save this. Share once. Ask twice. And one question remains for everyone listening. One question we should be asking next.